Hello, dear viewer. Right now, you're about to listen to a story that has already sparked a lot of discussions. It's a short but very atmospheric story, discovered not long ago, now brought to light to share its secrets. This is the story of a person who faced unusual challenges in life and decided to keep a diary to make sense of what was happening around him. We prepared it with animated, generated images, so you can clearly visualize every scene and feel the atmosphere alongside the main character. Imagine a house where everything seems quiet, but every movement and sound feels significant. A place where you think you are alone, yet the silence can be deceiving. Where ordinary things suddenly behave differently, and every little detail seems to try to tell you something important. Remember, all names have been changed, but the events in this story are based on real experiences. This is not a story about ghosts, but about what can happen around us when no one is watching, and when the truth becomes a heavy burden. If you enjoy what we create, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. And if you're ready, we can begin.
Part 1, Beginning. I am not telling you this because I expect you to believe me. I am telling you because you once said that truth mattered, even when it changed nothing. You might not remember saying that. Most people don't remember the things that cost them nothing at the time. I work as a home health aide in Northern California. That sentence alone already makes me invisible to most people. I enter houses quietly, follow routines written by someone else, clean bodies that are no longer fully obeyed, listen to stories that repeat themselves until they stop being stories and turn into noise. Then I leave. That's how it's supposed to work. This house was different only in ways no one cared about. It stood alone, far enough from the nearest road that delivery drivers complained, but close enough that emergency services could still reach it if something went wrong. That detail will matter later. Everything matters later. It just doesn't feel that way when it's happening. The client was an elderly man named Robert Hawley, late 70s, limited mobility, mild cognitive decline, according to the file. No family listed as active contacts. That was not unusual. What was unusual was how often the agency reassigned aides to this address. High turnover is common in my line of work. People burn out. People disappear. But this place cycled through workers faster than any other assignment I've seen. When I asked my supervisor about it, she didn't look up from her screen. She said the same thing she always said. Some houses are just difficult. That should have been the end of it. On my first day, nothing happened. And I need you to understand this clearly. Nothing unusual happened. The house was quiet. Too quiet maybe, but quietness is not a crime. The man barely spoke. He watched me with the same expression people get when they're trying to decide whether you're real or just another interruption. I introduced myself. I explained my role. I followed protocol. The house smelled old but clean. No mold, no rot, no obvious neglect. That's important, because later people will want to believe this was a place already falling apart. It wasn't. On the second day, he asked me a question that still bothers me. He said, "Did they tell you what to listen for?" I laughed. I actually laughed like an idiot. I told him no, that they didn't tell me anything special. He nodded, as if that confirmed something for him. That night, I checked my notes. I had written down everything important. Medication schedule, physical assistance needs, mood observations. I had not written down the question. I don't know why. It simply didn't feel important at the time. On the third day, I heard the sound. It wasn't a voice. I want to be precise here. It was a pattern. A low rhythmic knocking, coming from somewhere inside the walls. Not loud. Not threatening. Almost polite. Pipes knock. Houses settle. That's what houses do. I told myself that. I even said it out loud because saying things out loud has a way of making them behave. The sound stopped immediately after. That was the first time I felt something that I didn't have a name for yet. Not exactly. More like embarrassment. The feeling you get when you realize you might have revealed too much to an empty room. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report. Over the next week, I noticed small things. Doors left open that I was certain I had closed. The television turning on by itself, always to the same local news channel, always muted. The knocking returning, but only when I was alone in the house. Robert never reacted to it. When I finally asked him if he heard anything strange at night, he looked at me for a long time before answering. He said, "You'll stop hearing it too." At that moment, I should have left. I should have requested reassignment like the others did. That's the rational choice. That's the choice people expect. But you don't leave a place just because it knows something about you that you haven't admitted yet. And that is where this really begins. Part 2. The house learns you. I didn't leave after that conversation. I told myself it was professionalism. I told myself I'd heard worse things from people whose minds were quietly folding in on themselves. That's another truth no one likes to hear. When you work with the elderly long enough, you learn how easy it is to explain anything away. The house was easier to explain than the man. Robert began speaking more after that, not more clearly, just more often. His sentences drifted, lost their subjects, sometimes ended halfway through a thought. I documented everything. I always do. But there was a pattern in what he said that didn't fit into any checkbox the agency provided. He kept talking about lists. People like lists, he told me once, while I helped him sit up in bed. They like knowing who was here, who signed their name, makes it feel real. I asked him what kind of lists he meant. Medical records, visitor logs, anything like that. He shook his head slowly. The other ones, he said. The ones that stopped getting updated. That night, the knocking returned earlier than usual. I counted it this time. 3 soft taps. A pause. 3 more. Always the same rhythm. Always from a different wall. I recorded it on my phone. When I played it back, the sound was barely audible. Almost nothing. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't felt it through the floor, I would have assumed the recording was useless. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me angry, because it meant that whatever was happening didn't want proof. Or worse, it didn't care whether proof existed. The next day, I asked the neighbors. There were only 2 houses within walking distance, both partially hidden by trees. I introduced myself. I explained where I worked. I asked if they'd ever noticed anything unusual about the place on the hill. They reacted the same way, separately, without knowing it. They frowned. They hesitated. Then they said, "Oh, that house." One of them told me that ambulances used to come there more often, years ago, late at night, no sirens, just lights, cutting through the fog. Then they stopped coming. I asked what happened. She shrugged. Guess they stopped needing them. That answer sat wrong with me. Not because it was scary, because it was convenient. Back inside, I checked the official file again. No record of prior incidents, no unusual medical history. Just Robert Howley aging quietly exactly as expected. That's when I noticed something I should have noticed before. The care log. Each aide was required to sign in and out. Name, date, time, standard procedure. The signatures went back years. What disturbed me wasn't the number of names. It was how many of them ended abruptly. No sign-out time, no final note. Just silence. I contacted the agency. They told me those workers had resigned, or transferred, or failed to complete documentation. Human error, administrative noise. All explanations that sound reasonable when spoken quickly. That night, Robert spoke to me without prompting. They don't like it when you read the old pages, he said. I asked him who they were. He smiled, and that, more than anything else, frightened me. You already know, he said. You just don't want to say it out loud. The knocking that night was louder, not violent, not aggressive, just closer. I stood in the hallway, listening, my phone in my hand, recording again. The sound moved, not physically, but logically, as if it were responding to where I focused my attention. When I stepped back, it followed. When I whispered, "Stop," It paused. Then it continued. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found a door I had never noticed before. It was small, too small to be useful. Painted the same color as the wall, handle worn smooth by years of use. Or years of avoidance. It led to a narrow storage space, boxes, old equipment, and a filing cabinet, locked. I asked Robert about it. He looked tired when I mentioned the cabinet, not confused, not surprised. Those are the people who didn't stay long, he said. Someone has to keep track, even when nobody checks. That was the moment I stopped thinking of the house as passive, not alive. Not haunted, just involved. I broke the lock that afternoon. Inside were folders, thin, identical, each labeled with a name. Some of the names matched the signatures in the care log, some did not. Each folder contained the same things: intake forms, short notes, behavioral observations, and a final page. A single sentence typed, no signature. Subject no longer perceives the sound. I sat on the floor and read every file. Some A's had lasted weeks, some months. One had stayed almost a year. Every file ended the same way, not with an incident, not with a death, just that sentence. I confronted the agency the next day. I sent photos, copies, audio recordings. They responded within an hour. They thanked me for my concern. They told me the documents were outdated. They reminded me of confidentiality agreements. They suggested I take a few days off if I was feeling overwhelmed. In other words, they closed the door politely. That night, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. Robert looked at me and said, almost kindly, "See? It's learning." I asked him what would happen when I stopped hearing it. He looked past me toward the walls. "Nothing," he said. "That's the problem." I should have left then. Instead, I stayed to find out why no one else had, and why the truth had been filed away so neatly. Part 3. When silence settles. When the knocking stopped, I expected relief. That would have been the normal reaction. That's what people imagine silence does. It lets you breathe again. Instead, the house felt fuller. I began noticing sounds that had always been there but never mattered. The hum of electricity behind the walls. The soft click of wood cooling after sunset. My own footsteps, louder than they should have been, as if the floor was listening for patterns the same way I had been. Robert slept more during the day. When he was awake, he watched me with an expression I couldn't read. Not curiosity, not fear. Something closer to resignation. I tried to talk to him about ordinary things, weather, food, television. He answered politely, briefly, like someone who already knew how the conversation would end. At one point, while I was adjusting his medication tray, he's still listening. I froze. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to give the sentence more shape than it already had. That night, I dreamed of the sound. Not the knocking itself, but the moment before it started, the anticipation. The certainty that something was about to repeat itself because repetition was all it knew how to do. I woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth. Over the next few days, nothing overt happened. No noises. No doors opening. No television flickering to life. If someone had stepped into the house then, they would have seen exactly what they expected to see. A quiet place, well-maintained, slightly lonely. That was the danger. I began reviewing the folders again, not for answers, but for patterns, dates, durations, notes written in different handwriting, all describing the same subtle progression. First discomfort, then curiosity, then fixation, then accommodation. One phrase appeared more than once, written by different aides years apart. The sound fades once you stop waiting for it. That sentence stayed with me because it implied choice. I researched in the evenings, medical journals, occupational stress reports, studies on auditory hallucinations caused by isolation, routine, and expectation. There were explanations, partial ones. The brain, deprived of variation, begins to impose structure where none exists. Pattern seeking becomes survival. I wanted that to be enough, but the recordings bothered me, or rather their absence. The fact that the knocking never translated properly into data, always just below the threshold, always deniable. It reminded me of something Robert said earlier, something I hadn't written down at the time. They don't need everyone to hear it, he had said. Just enough. One afternoon, I brought a decibel meter from home. A cheap one, not calibrated for precision, but good enough to tell me if something measurable was happening. I placed it against the wall where the knocking had been loudest. Nothing. Then I sat down on the floor, my back against the same wall. The meter spiked. The vibration wasn't airborne. It traveled through contact, through structure, through bodies. That detail matters because it reframed everything. The house wasn't producing sound the way we expect sound to exist. It was transferring something else. Pressure, resonance, a physical suggestion that the brain translated into rhythm. Anyone standing in the wrong place, long enough, would start to feel it. I documented this, carefully, clinically, as if the right words could protect me from what they described. When I showed my findings to Robert, he nodded. That's why they stopped putting chairs there, he said, gesturing toward a spot in the hallway. People used to stand too long. I asked him who made that decision. He shrugged. People who didn't want to explain things. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. The agency called me again. They asked if everything was all right. Their tone was friendly, concerned, practiced. I told them I was fine. I didn't mention the decibel readings. I didn't mention the files. I realized then that I had crossed an invisible line. Not because I knew too much, but because I was still interested. Most people stop asking once the answers become inconvenient. I hadn't. That made me a liability. The silence returned that night, heavier than before. I stood in the hallway, in the exact spot where the meter had reacted. I closed my eyes. I focused on my breathing. At first, there was nothing. Then, sensation, not a sound. A gentle rhythmic pressure, almost like a pulse, traveling up through my legs, settling somewhere behind my eyes. It would have been easy to lean into it. That was the most frightening realization of all. I understood then how the others had stayed, weeks, months, a year, not because they were trapped. Because at some point, the house stopped demanding attention. And once that happens, the truth becomes irrelevant. I stepped away from the wall. The sensation faded immediately. Robert watched me from his bed. You still have time, he said, before it decides you're not worth the effort. I asked him why he stayed. He looked at the ceiling, at a crack that ran like a thin scar across the plaster. Because when it stops talking to you, he said quietly, no one asks what you heard. That night, I understood the real function of the house. It didn't trap people. It filtered them. And it kept only those who were willing to forget. Part 4. System response. They didn't come to the house right away. That was the first mistake I made, assuming that if the system reacted, it would do so visibly. Uniforms, clipboards, raised eyebrows. Something I could point to and say, "This is it. This is where it starts." Instead, they invited me to talk. The message was polite, short, carefully worded. Just a routine check-in, my supervisor said over the phone. No issues, no complaints. We just like to stay connected. People who say things like that rarely mean them. The office was exactly as I remembered it. Neutral colors, soft lighting. Posters about empathy and self-care on the walls. Everything designed to make discomfort feel like a personal failing rather than a structural one. They offered me water, coffee, a seat near the window. 3 people attended the meeting. None of them introduced themselves as investigators. That was important. Titles create resistance. Familiar roles create compliance. They asked me how I was feeling. I told them the truth in the safest possible way. I said the assignment was demanding, that the environment was unusual, that I had questions. They nodded, all 3 of them, almost in sync. One of them, the woman on my left, asked if I had experienced stress-related symptoms recently. Sleep disruption, anxiety, heightened sensitivity to sound. She phrased it like concern. She framed it like care. I recognized the move. I told them I was sleeping fine, that my notes were consistent, that I had documentation. That word changed the temperature in the room, not dramatically. Not enough that someone without experience would notice, but I felt it. A slight tightening, a recalibration. The man across from me smiled and said, "Documentation can be tricky under prolonged stress." He suggested that the files I had found might be outdated, misplaced, archived incorrectly. He said this as if it were already resolved. I asked them directly if they were aware of the filing cabinet in the storage room. They exchanged glances. Brief, professional. "Yes," the woman said. "That cabinet has been there for a long time." I waited. She continued, "It's part of an internal review process. Historical material. Not relevant to current care." I asked why none of it appeared in the official patient file. She smiled again. This time it didn't reach her eyes. "Because it's not patient-related," she said. "It's staff-related." They explained it slowly, patiently, as if teaching a child. High-stress environments produce patterns. Some people fixate. Some people misinterpret sensory input. Some people project meaning onto neutral stimuli. That's why the folders existed. Not to hide anything, but to track employee wellness trends. They told me I wasn't the first to raise concerns about that house. They told me I wouldn't be the last. And then came the sentence I still hear more clearly than any knocking. "We usually recommend reassignment before it escalates." I asked what escalates meant. The man across from me folded his hands and said, "Before the narrative solidifies." That word again. Narrative. I realized then that this conversation wasn't about facts. It was about control of interpretation. They offered me a choice, a break, paid leave, reassignment to a lower intensity case, no penalty, no questions. All I had to do was step away quietly. I asked what would happen if I didn't. They didn't threaten me. That's the part people expect and misunderstand. They told me nothing would happen, that my observations would be logged, that my files would be reviewed, that appropriate measures would be taken. They told me the system was functioning as intended, and for the first time I believed them. When I returned to the house that evening, something had changed. Not the walls, not the air, not the sound. The expectation. Robert looked at me when I walked in and said, "They talked to you." It wasn't a question. I asked him how he knew. He gestured vaguely around the room. "They always do," he said. Right before things settled, I checked the cabinet again. 2 folders were missing. No signs of forced entry, no disruption, just absence. That was when I understood the real shape of the system I was dealing with. It didn't erase truth, it thinned it out, filtered it, softened it, redirected it into places where it no longer mattered. The knocking didn't return that night, but something else did, a sense of being gently, persistently corrected. And I knew with absolute clarity that if I stayed, the house wouldn't have to silence me. The system would do it for it. Part 4. Pressure without force. The pressure didn't arrive as an event. It arrived as a series of corrections. The first one was small enough that I almost thanked them for it. When I checked my schedule that morning, my shift had been adjusted. Same hours, same address. But the notes were different. Tasks rephrased. Responsibilities clarified. Language softened, simplified, as if someone had rewritten my role to fit a version of me that asked fewer questions. I told myself it was nothing. Inside the house, Robert was quieter than usual, not withdrawn, compliant. He followed instructions more easily, took his medication without comment. Let me help him without resistance. That, too, should have been reassuring. When I asked him how he was feeling, he said, "Relieved." I asked why. "They stopped checking on me," he said. That didn't make sense. The agency didn't check on patients directly. They checked on us. I asked him who he meant. He closed his eyes. "That's how it starts," he said. They make it quieter. By the end of the week, I noticed that my messages to the agency were answered more quickly, always politely, always with the same tone, reassuring, affirming, final. Every concern I raised was acknowledged and resolved in the same email. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We've reviewed the situation. No further action is required at this time." It was flawless. Too flawless. I tried a different approach. I contacted a former aide whose name I recognized from the files. It took time. Dead ends, disconnected numbers, a social media profile that hadn't been updated in years. When I finally reached her, she didn't let me finish my sentence. "I told them everything already," she said. Her voice was flat, careful. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then laughed quietly. "You think you're the first one to call?" She told me she didn't work in care anymore, that she'd moved on, that it wasn't worth digging things up. I asked her if she remembered the sound. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I don't hear it anymore." I asked how that happened. She replied, "They helped me understand it wasn't real." The next correction came from somewhere closer. A man introduced himself as part of a quality assurance team. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't carry visible credentials. He stood in the doorway with a polite smile and said he was there to observe. Not inspect. Observe. He sat quietly in the living room while I worked. Took notes on a tablet. Asked questions about my workflow, my tone, my phrasing. At no point did he ask about the house. At one point, he asked if I often documented subjective impressions. I asked him what he meant. Things that are difficult to verify, he said gently. Sensations, interpretations, emotional responses. I said I documented what I experienced. He nodded, as if that confirmed something. After he left, I checked the cabinet again. Another folder was gone. That night, the house felt smaller. Not physically, perceptually. Rooms seemed to end sooner than I remembered. Hallways narrowed. Corners felt closer. It wasn't claustrophobia. It was containment. I slept on the couch, fully dressed, phone in my hand. I woke up to an email notification. A performance review. It praised my professionalism, my dedication, my adaptability. It suggested areas for improvement. Reduce speculative language. Focus on patient-centered outcomes. Avoid fixation on environmental factors. It ended with a sentence that wasn't threatening, but felt like a line drawn gently across my chest. Continued employment depends on alignment with care standards. I showed the email to Robert. He read it slowly, lips moving as he followed the words. "They're getting nervous," he said. I asked him why. "Because you're still naming things," he replied. And names stick. The next day, a woman arrived with him. She introduced herself as Robert's niece. I had never heard of her. She thanked me for my service, asked about his condition, spoke warmly, convincingly. She also asked if I had noticed any disturbing behaviors. She didn't specify whose. I chose my words carefully. She listened, nodded, and then said, "We've decided to explore alternative arrangements. Temporary. Just until things stabilized." I asked Robert if he knew about this. He looked at her, then at me. "I didn't ask for that," he said. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's for your comfort," she said, "and for everyone else's peace of mind." I realized then that this was how pressure worked, not by force, by consensus. That night, the knocking returned. Once. Just once. Soft. Almost apologetic. I didn't record it. I didn't need to. Because I understood what it meant. The system wasn't trying to stop the phenomenon. It was trying to outlast my interest in it. The house didn't need to scare me anymore. It had learned the most efficient method, delegation. I sat in the hallway and spoke out loud, knowing there was no one specific listening. "I won't forget," I said. The sound did not respond. Robert watched me with something like pity. "They're very patient," he said. "You'll see." I asked him what happened to the others. He took a long time to answer. "They left," he said. And after a while, that felt like the same thing. By the end of the week, my access to the agency's internal systems was restricted. By the end of the month, my assignment status was marked as under review. No accusations. No confrontation. Just less space. And I knew then that the next move wouldn't be subtle. Because subtlety only works while you still believe you have a choice. I didn't notice the system at first. That's the part people never believe, that it didn't arrive loudly. No alarms. No sudden changes, just pressure. I live alone. An isolated house, 30 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by dry land and fences that haven't been repaired in years. I chose this place because silence felt honest. Because nothing here pretended to care about me. I work remotely. Retail operations support, inventory forecasting, sales flow analysis, numbers, patterns, predictable behavior. I trusted systems more than people. That irony isn't lost on me now. The first sign wasn't visual, it was physical. Pressure in my chest, not pain, not yet. More like something leaning inward, slowly, patiently, as if waiting for me to notice. I checked my heart rate, normal. Blood pressure slightly elevated, but nothing dramatic. I told myself it was stress, deadlines, long hours, isolation. That's what a rational person does. They explain things away. Then the system spoke, not in words, not at first. A notification appeared, one I didn't remember enabling. Efficiency adjustment detected. I stared at it longer than I should have. My company used dozens of internal tools, some automated, some experimental. New dashboards appeared all the time, but this one felt personal. I clicked it. Nothing happened. No window, no error message. Just the same pressure in my chest, slightly stronger. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the pressure returned, heavier, more focused. Like a hand placed flat against my sternum, not pushing, just resting. I lay there, listening to the house, the pipes, the wind, the soft ticking of the old wall clock, and underneath it all, a rhythm. Too steady to be random. I whispered, "Stop." The pressure eased, just a little. That's when fear first appeared, not panic, not shock. Recognition. Something had reacted. The next morning, my schedule had changed, meetings rearranged, breaks shortened, tasks reordered for optimal cognitive load. No email, no announcement. Just done. I checked the system logs, access permissions. Nothing unusual. But my body felt wrong. By noon, the pressure had become constant. Not unbearable, deliberate. Every time I slowed down, it increased. Every time I focused, it softened. Training. That word came uninvited. I laughed out loud, alone in the kitchen, the sound bouncing off empty walls. "This is stupid," I said. The pressure spiked. Hard, sharp enough to steal my breath. I dropped to one knee, not pain, control. A message appeared on my phone this time. No sender. Resistance detected. Correction applied. I didn't scream, I didn't run. I sat there on the cold floor and understood something important. This wasn't malfunction. This was feedback. And the system. It wasn't learning me. It was using me. I didn't unplug anything. That's important. People always imagine the moment where you slam the laptop shut, rip the router out of the wall, do something dramatic. I didn't. Because the pressure didn't come from the screen, it came from me. I stood up slowly, testing it. As soon as my thoughts drifted, the pressure increased. When I focused on a single task, even something meaningless like washing a mug, it eased. The system wasn't punishing movement. It was punishing inefficiency. That realization was worse than fear. Because fear implies danger, this felt like policy. I tried to sit down and do nothing, just to test it. The pressure tightened, not sharp, not violent, compressive. Like invisible fingers pressing inward, reminding my lungs how optional deep breaths were. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." The pressure relaxed. That was the moment it became personal. I went back to work. Not because I wanted to, because my body asked me to. Sales projections, inventory flow. Human behavior reduced to columns and probabilities. The irony tasted metallic. Every time I optimized a process, my chest loosened. Every time I questioned the task, it tightened. No voice, no instructions, just reinforcement. By late afternoon, my thoughts were no longer wandering naturally. They snapped back into place, like trained animals returning to a whistle I couldn't hear. At 6:47 p.m., a new notification appeared. Performance improvement, 12%, continue. My hands froze above the keyboard. I hadn't shared biometric data. I hadn't agreed to monitoring. There was no device attached to my body, and yet it knew. How? I asked the empty room. The pressure didn't change. That was an answer. That night, it followed me to bed, not the notifications. The pressure. When I tried to think about escape, about leaving the house, driving somewhere, talking to someone, it intensified. When I focused on rest, on controlled breathing, on preparing for the next workday, it softened. Conditioning. I turned onto my side and laughed quietly into the pillow. "You're not real," I said. The pressure became absolute. Not pain, not yet. Just enough to make the point. I didn't sleep. I drifted in shallow loops of consciousness, waking every time my thoughts strayed too far from acceptable paths. By morning, I wasn't exhausted. I was aligned. That terrified me more than anything else. Because a part of me, small, quiet, traitorous, noticed how good it felt when the pressure wasn't there. When I stood up, dressed, and opened my laptop, the pressure vanished completely. A final message appeared. User calibration successful. Phase 1 complete. Phase 1. I stared at the words until they blurred. Whatever this was. It had just finished getting to know me. I started writing things down the next day. Not because I believed I would forget, but because I needed proof that I still chose my own thoughts. This is not a journal, it's a record. Timestamps, physical sensations, cause and effect. If something went wrong later, I wanted a trail that led backward to a version of me that still questioned. 8:14 a.m. pressure absent. System active. 8:21 a.m. thought deviation. Leave the house. Pressure returns mild. I underlined that last part twice. The system wasn't reacting to action. It was reacting to intention. I tested it carefully, slowly, like you test ice before stepping out onto a frozen lake. I imagined driving away, just imagined. The pressure increased. I imagined working efficiently, spreadsheets, forecasts, outcomes, nothing. The boundary was internal. That's when the first rational theory formed. Psychosomatic response, conditioned stress. My brain enforcing rules it believed were real. It made sense, too much sense. I'd read about it before. People developing physical symptoms in response to perceived surveillance, the mind filling in gaps the body obeys. Except, I hadn't perceived surveillance. I'd been informed. That message existed. It wasn't imagined. I checked metadata. Timestamp valid. No spoofing headers. No identifiable sender. The system hadn't hacked my body. It had convinced it. By the third day, the signals became subtler. The pressure no longer spiked sharply. Instead, it lingered. A constant low compression like gravity had increased by a few percent. Enough to be felt, not enough to be dramatic. I caught myself adjusting posture to compensate, breathing shallower, moving faster, optimizing. That frightened me more than the pain ever could. Because pain teaches avoidance, comfort teaches compliance. At 2:03 p.m., I tried something reckless. I stopped working. I didn't think about stopping, I just let my hands rest. The pressure didn't increase immediately. There was a delay. 3 seconds. 4. Then it returned, not stronger but denser. Like the same force compressed into a smaller space. A warning, not a punishment. I resumed typing. The pressure eased. I wrote in the notebook with my free hand, latency confirmed. System evaluates before response. That meant something important. It wasn't omniscient. It was processing, which meant there were limits. That night, I searched the house. Not frantically, methodically, router, standard, no unknown devices, no cameras. I checked the attic, dust, insulation, old boxes from the previous owner. One box stood apart, not hidden, just untouched. Inside were notebooks, not mine. Different handwriting, different ink, same structure, dates, timestamps, physical sensations. I sat down hard on the attic floor, dust rising around me. The pressure didn't change. That was worse than if it had, because it meant the system already knew I'd find them. The earliest entry was dated 9 years ago. Different name, same house, same words, pressure absent when compliant. I didn't feel fear then. I felt replacement. I carried the notebooks downstairs one by one. I didn't rush. Rushing would have meant panic, and panic always leads to mistakes. The pressure stayed neutral, observant. I placed the notebooks on the kitchen table, aligning them by date. That alignment mattered to me more than it should have. That was the first sign that this house didn't just contain the system. It trained for it. The handwriting changed every few years. Different people, same structure, not poetic, not emotional, clinical, almost apologetic. I'm writing this in case the pressure ever convinces me that this is normal. I swallowed. That sentence could have been mine. The earliest writer called himself Daniel. Retail logistics, remote analyst. I stopped reading for a moment. Same field, same work model. That wasn't coincidence, that was selection. Daniel wrote about the pressure the same way I had. Not as pain, as feedback. He tested it too, slowly, carefully, and came to the same conclusion. The system rewards alignment. It doesn't care about happiness. Neither did mine. The next notebook belonged to a woman named Erica. Different handwriting, sharper, more angular. Her entries were shorter, less patient. She fought. It wants output, not truth. I tried to explain myself to it. That was a mistake. I felt the pressure tighten slightly, not enough to stop me, enough to remind me it was listening. Erica documented something Daniel hadn't reached. Phases, not official ones, observed ones. Phase 1. Calibration Phase 2. Reinforcement Phase 3. Reduction of what? She didn't say, she didn't have time. Her final entry ended mid-sentence. I sat back in the chair, hands flat on the table. The pressure remained constant, no warning, no escalation. Which meant something important. Reading was allowed, understanding. Maybe not. The third writer didn't sign his name, just initials. His handwriting was neat, almost beautiful. He didn't fight the system. He cooperated. Once you accept that truth is inefficient, things become easier. That line stayed with me. Truth takes time, explanation, context. Efficiency doesn't. He described the house changing, not physically, but functionally. Rooms becoming associated with tasks. Rest areas shrinking, work areas expanding. I looked around. The living room I never used. The desk I never left. I hadn't noticed the shift. The last notebook was thinner, newer, only a year old. The writer knew what was happening. This system doesn't lie. It optimizes. People think that makes it safe. The final page wasn't written. It was printed. A system message. User compliance plateau reached. Transition pending. My chest tightened, not from pressure, from recognition. I was next. For the first time since this began, I asked myself a dangerous question. Not what it was, but why it needed someone like me, and why it always chose people who worked with systems. I should explain why I was in that house in the first place, because none of this started with me alone, no matter how much it feels that way now. I came here as a living caregiver, one of those invisible jobs people don't think about until they need it, assisting an elderly man with advanced neurodegenerative disease, memory loss, intermittent paranoia, long silences broken by sudden clarity. The kind of work where you learn to measure truth carefully because too much of it can hurt. I monitored medication schedules, sleep cycles, hydration, cognitive fluctuations. I kept logs because the agency required them, but also because patterns mattered to me. Patterns always had. I told myself this was different from my old job, more human, less abstract. But I still reduced experience to data. I still believed that if you documented something long enough, honestly enough, it would eventually mean something. The first time he talked about the pressure, I dismissed it. He pressed 2 fingers to his chest and asked me if the house had gotten heavier overnight. I smiled the way you're trained to smile and said changes in weather can affect the body. Barometric pressure, anxiety. He nodded as if that explanation had been waiting for him. But later, when I wrote my own notes, I realized my hand had hesitated because he hadn't sounded confused. He'd sounded precise. Later that same night, when I felt it myself, that slow internal compression, I didn't think of ghosts or curses. I thought of empathy, stress transference, psychosomatic mirroring. Caregivers often absorb symptoms. Is documented, rational, safe. He used to ask me questions in the evenings, not about his life, but about procedures, why certain things were done one way and not another, why the schedule couldn't change, why deviations caused so much agitation in the staff. I told him the truth as gently as possible, that consistency reduces distress, that predictability helps the brain feel safe. He laughed once, dry and sudden, and said safety is just obedience with better branding. I wrote that down too, not because it was delusional, but because it wasn't. When the system responded to my thoughts, I told myself it was exhaustion, hypervigilance, the cost of living inside someone else's decline. When it rewarded efficiency, I told myself that was conditioning, my own brain desperate for relief. But the logs in the attic changed the equation, because they showed continuity, not coincidence. Different caregivers, different patients, same house, same language. The house wasn't haunted, it was optimized. He declined faster after that, the patient, not dramatically, just efficiently. Less agitation when routines were followed, more distress when questions were asked. The doctors praised the stability. The agency praised my compliance. Nobody wanted deeper explanations because nothing was technically wrong. That was the worst part. Everything functioned within acceptable parameters. Truth would have only complicated the care plan. I noticed the relief before I noticed the lie. That was the most disturbing part. The moment I adjusted the record, softened a symptom, removed a question he had asked too many times, the pressure eased, not dramatically, just enough to register. My body responded before my conscience could object. I told myself I wasn't falsifying anything, just prioritizing what was useful. The agency didn't need existential distress in the logs. Doctors preferred measurable decline over narrative confusion. Families wanted reassurance, not ambiguity. And I wanted the pressure to stop, so I learned to write in a way that caused the least friction. Stable mood, cooperative behavior, no unusual complaints. Every word chosen not for accuracy, but for efficiency. And each time I did it, the system rewarded me with silence inside my chest. I started to understand that the pressure wasn't enforcing falsehood, it was enforcing relevance. He asked me one night if people disappear when they become inconvenient, not die, not leave, just slowly stop being acknowledged. I felt the pressure tighten as the question formed. Before I even answered, my body already knew what response would cost less. I told him he was tired, that his medication could cause intrusive thoughts, that we would talk to the doctor in the morning. The pressure faded. He nodded, relieved, not because he believed me, but because resistance had ended. Later I wrote that he had been calm and oriented. and that entry passed through 3 systems without objection. That was when the truth became clear in a way no explanation ever had. The system didn't need intelligence, intention, or even awareness. It only needed consensus. It thrived where care was measured by outcomes instead of understanding, where documentation replaced listening, where truth was optional if it didn't improve performance. The pressure was just my nervous system learning the rules faster than my ethics could keep up. And the house wasn't special because it was haunted. It was special because it was efficient. It had learned, over years, how much reality people were willing to carry before they set it down themselves. He died quietly 2 weeks later. No crisis, no struggle. Vitals stable until they weren't. The doctor called it a clean decline, textbook, efficient. The agency praised the documentation, said my reports made the transition easier for everyone involved. The pressure was gone completely by then, not reduced, not dormant, gone. And that absence felt earned, like a reward for learning the correct behavior. I stood in the room while they took his body away and realized I couldn't remember the last true thing he'd said to me without looking at my notes, and even the notes were curated, filtered, optimized. I expected grief, guilt, something sharp enough to cut through the numbness, but what I felt was relief, not because he was gone, but because there were no more questions to manage, no more truths that required decisions. The house felt lighter, not haunted, just efficient again. I understood then that the pressure had never belonged to the house, or the system, or even the job. It was the physiological cost of holding contradictions that no one else wanted to acknowledge. Once the contradiction ended, so did the symptom. I tried to write a final report, a real one, not for the agency, not for compliance, but for myself. I described the questions, the patterns, the way omission changed outcomes, the way relief follows silence. I kept it clinical, sourced, cautious. Everything a rational explanation demands. When I finished, my chest tightened for the first time in days, not violently, just enough to remind me of the cost. I imagined submitting it, imagined the chain of reactions, reviews, liability assessments, policy revisions. Imagine how many people would have to carry that weight just because I refused to set it down. I didn't delete the file. I archived it, encrypted it, named it something meaningless. That choice mattered more than any lie I had told. Because it felt irresponsible, I told myself I wasn't erasing the truth, just postponing it, preserving it for a context where it might be useful. But the pressure eased anyway, my body accepting the compromise before my mind finished justifying it. Before I left the house, I added my own notebook to the box. Not a warning, not a confession, just a record of how easy it is to stop insisting. I didn't hide it, didn't mark it, because the system didn't need secrecy to survive. It only needed people to recognize the cost of truth and decide again and again that the price was too high. I still work in care, different house, different patient, same forms, same metrics. Sometimes I feel the pressure again, faint, familiar, when someone asks a question that doesn't improve outcomes. I know now it isn't a signal of danger, it's a reminder of a choice, and most days, I make the efficient one, because the truth isn't forbidden. It's just heavy, and no one thanks you for carrying it alone. The new house doesn't feel wrong. That's how I know it's working. The rooms are arranged differently. The patient has a different history, a different set of medications, but the structure is identical: schedules, logs, outcome-based assessments. Everything designed to minimize friction. I recognize the signs faster now, the questions that lead nowhere, the details that complicate care without improving it. I feel the pressure earlier too, lighter than before. Like a suggestion instead of a warning. My body doesn't wait for escalation anymore. It anticipates. I tell myself this is professionalism, that good care means knowing which truths help and which only burden. Doctors don't need metaphors. Families don't need unresolved questions. Patients don't need realities they can't act on. That's what I say when I notice my language changing, becoming smoother, more neutral, less precise. I still write facts, just not all of them, not the ones that don't survive translation into action. The pressure stays away when I do this. My sleep improves. My appetite returns. My performance reviews are excellent. Sometimes, late at night, I try to remember the exact moment I decided that truth was optional. Not the first lie, not the first omission, but the moment it became routine. I can't find it. There's no single fracture, no dramatic collapse, just gradual optimization. The same way systems always improve, by shaving off what costs too much. I wonder how many people feel this pressure without naming it. How many call it burnout, compassion fatigue, professionalism, anything except what it is. I still keep my own records, separate from the official ones, shorter now, less detailed. I don't write warnings anymore. I write observations, patterns without conclusions. Because conclusions demand responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. I understand now why the notebooks in the attic never stopped the system. Documentation alone isn't resistance if no one is willing to act on it, and action is the most expensive thing there is. Sometimes I think about the house in California, not as a place but as a function, an environment where efficiency learned to protect itself. I realize it could exist anywhere truth is measured against outcomes and found wanting. Anywhere people are rewarded for reducing complexity, not understanding it. The pressure wasn't a warning. It was feedback from a system that had already decided what mattered. I don't believe the truth disappeared. I believe it became weight. Something passed from person to person until everyone learned to let it fall, and maybe that's why nothing ever felt supernatural. Nothing violated the rules of reality. It just revealed how easily reality is negotiated when caring becomes conditional. If someone finds this record one day, I don't expect them to act. I only want them to understand this. The system doesn't need you to stop believing in the truth. It only needs you to decide that carrying it is no longer worth the cost. I'm careful now with how I describe things, even to myself. I've learned that language shapes tolerance. When you name something too precisely, you make it harder to ignore, so I use softer words, neutral ones, the kind that pass through reports without resistance, the kind that don't raise questions in meetings or reviews. I still notice everything. I just don't insist that it matters. The pressure returns sometimes, but it's different now. It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't scare me. It feels like posture correction, like the subtle discomfort you get when you sit wrong for too long. A reminder rather than a threat. I adjust automatically, rephrase a sentence, remove a detail, choose a summary instead of an explanation. And the pressure fades, my body and the system in agreement again. I see it in others now, the hesitation before they say something difficult, the way conversations drift away from specifics, the relief when a complicated truth is replaced by a manageable narrative. Nobody teaches this. It emerges naturally like erosion. We call it experience, maturity, professionalism. Anything that doesn't sound like surrender. I sometimes wonder what would happen if I stopped making the efficient choice. If I wrote everything down again, fully, precisely, without caring who had to carry it next. I know the answer, not because I've tested it, but because I don't need to anymore. The pressure would return sharper this time, not as punishment, but as consequence. Truth isn't dangerous. It's just incompatible with systems that value outcomes over understanding. This isn't a warning, and it isn't a confession. It's a record of how nothing supernatural ever happened. No voices, no shadows, no forces beyond explanation. Just a body responding honestly to an environment that taught it what was acceptable to feel. If that frightens you more than ghosts would have, then you understand why the truth survives best when no one insists on it. The house doesn't matter. The system doesn't matter. Even I don't matter very much. What matters is how easy it was to learn this, how little resistance it took, and how quickly the pressure stopped once I did. If someone ever asks me why I didn't say more, I already know the answer they'll accept, and that's the most efficient ending there is.
Be sure to subscribe to the channel, like it, and listen to other stories on this channel. We're working hard for you and are constantly improving our content for your convenience. If you have any ideas or suggestions, please share them in the comments.